Welcome back to the channel. Today we're uncovering the incredible story of how a tiny island with almost no natural resources transformed itself into what many people call the world's most perfect city. From strict laws and futuristic technology to world-class infrastructure and long-term planning, Singapore's success wasn't built by chance. It was carefully engineered, one decision at a time. Let's find out how they did it. Before you ever see Singapore's famous skyline, before you notice the spotless sidewalks, the futuristic gardens, or the trains arriving almost exactly on time, something much smaller catches your attention. Nobody seems to be in a hurry, yet everything moves with incredible precision. Cars stop exactly where they should. Pedestrians wait patiently, even when the road is empty. Construction sites operate with almost no visible chaos. Trash bins rarely overflow because someone has already emptied them long before they became full.
It almost feels artificial, as if the city has been programmed instead of built. Visitors often describe Singapore as the cleanest, safest, and most organized city they've ever experienced. Some even call it the closest thing the modern world has to a perfect city. But perfection doesn't happen by accident. Every tree, every apartment block, every law, every camera, every dollar spent, and even every drop of drinking water is part of a much larger system that most people never notice. The real story of Singapore isn't about luxury or skyscrapers, it's about survival. Because just 60 years ago, almost nobody believed this tiny island had any chance of becoming a successful country at all. In fact, many believed it wouldn't survive a single generation. Today, Singapore is often presented as a miracle, but miracles usually suggest luck. Singapore's rise had almost nothing to do with luck.
It began with a crisis so severe that the country's leaders were forced to think differently from almost everyone else. When Singapore became independent in 1965, the situation looked hopeless. The country had no oil, no gold, no large rivers, almost no natural resources, and not even enough land to support its growing population. Unlike larger nations, it couldn't rely on farming because there simply wasn't enough space. It couldn't depend on mining because there was nothing valuable underground. Even fresh water became a national concern because much of it had to be imported from neighboring Malaysia. Worse still, Singapore had just been separated from Malaysia after political disagreements made cooperation impossible. Overnight, the island lost access to a much larger domestic market, while also finding itself surrounded by countries that weren't exactly eager to help it succeed. Unemployment was high, poverty was widespread, and ethnic tensions threatened to explode into violence.
The government faced an almost impossible question. How do you build a country when you have almost nothing to build it with? Most governments would have searched for quick economic fixes or foreign aid. Singapore chose something far more unusual. Instead of asking how to become rich, its leaders first asked how to eliminate chaos. That small change in thinking shaped almost everything that followed. The government believed investors wouldn't risk their money in an unstable country, businesses wouldn't grow in dirty cities, and talented people wouldn't stay if they didn't feel safe. So before chasing wealth, Singapore focused on creating order. Laws became stricter, public services became more reliable, infrastructure was planned years before it was actually needed. Corruption, which had been common during the colonial period, became one of the government's primary targets. This wasn't simply about morality, it was about economics. Every bribe slowed development.
Every dishonest official increased costs. Every inefficient decision scared away investment. If Singapore couldn't compete through size or natural resources, it had to compete through trust. That decision would eventually transform one of the world's poorest territories into one of its richest economies. But trust is much harder to build than roads or office towers. It requires institutions that continue functioning even when individual leaders change. Singapore invested enormous effort into building exactly that. Government agencies were redesigned to reward competence instead of political loyalty. Civil servants received competitive salaries that reduced the temptation of corruption. Promotions increasingly depended on measurable performance rather than personal connections. These policies weren't universally admired, and critics argued they concentrated too much power inside the government. Yet, from an administrative perspective, the results became difficult to ignore.
International companies began discovering something unusual about Singapore. Contracts were enforced. Regulations remained relatively predictable. Infrastructure projects were completed on schedule. Bureaucratic delays were minimized compared to many neighboring countries. Over time, reliability itself became one of Singapore's most valuable exports. While other nations competed mainly on lower wages, Singapore increasingly competed on certainty. Businesses could plan years ahead because they believed the rules would remain stable. That confidence attracted investment far beyond what the island's physical size should have allowed. But creating order solved only one problem. Another challenge was even more dangerous. Singapore simply didn't have enough land. The entire country occupies roughly the same area as many medium-sized cities elsewhere in the world.
Every new factory, apartment building, highway, school, hospital, airport expansion, or industrial park competed for the same limited space. A mistake in land planning couldn't easily be corrected because there was nowhere else to expand. This forced Singapore to think about land differently than almost every other country. Instead of allowing cities to grow naturally over decades, planners began designing entire neighborhoods years before construction started. Housing wasn't treated as an afterthought. It became one of the central pillars of national stability. The government launched massive public housing programs that eventually transformed where and how people lived. Today, the overwhelming majority of Singapore's population lives in government-developed apartment complexes. To many outsiders, public housing sounds like low-income accommodation. In Singapore, it became something entirely different. These neighborhoods include schools, parks, shopping centers, clinics, sports facilities, public transportation, and green spaces carefully integrated into daily life. Many middle-class families willingly choose to live there because the quality remains consistently high. Home ownership also became a political strategy. Citizens who owned property were believed to have a stronger incentive to maintain stability and invest in the country's future. Instead of creating large areas divided strictly by wealth or ethnicity, housing policies attempted to maintain balanced communities. The goal wasn't merely providing shelter, it was preventing social fragmentation before it could develop. Yet, housing alone couldn't guarantee long-term success. The economy still needed something valuable to sell. Without natural resources, Singapore had to transform its people into its greatest asset. Education, therefore, became another national priority, but not simply in the traditional sense.
Schools increasingly aligned with the country's economic strategy. As industries evolved, education adapted alongside them. Technical skills received major attention because manufacturing required trained workers. Later, financial services demanded different expertise. Then biotechnology, engineering, logistics, artificial intelligence, and advanced research gradually entered the picture. Instead of assuming one educational model would last forever, Singapore repeatedly adjusted its system to match changing global markets. This flexibility became one of its greatest competitive advantages. Companies didn't just find modern office buildings when they arrived. They found workers whose skills often matched exactly what growing industries required. That alignment between education and economic planning helped accelerate development at a remarkable pace. Still, even education couldn't solve Singapore's biggest physical limitation. Land could be carefully planned, Workers could be highly trained. Government could operate efficiently. But none of that changed one unavoidable reality. Singapore remained one of the most resource-poor countries on Earth. It still lacked enough fresh water, enough energy, enough agricultural land, and enough room to keep expanding naturally. Every success created new pressure. Every additional resident increased demand for housing, transportation, electricity, and clean water. Every new company required more infrastructure. In many countries, growth gradually solves economic problems. In Singapore, growth constantly creates entirely new ones. The remarkable part isn't that the city became rich. It's that every solution forced the country to invent another one, turning survival itself into an endless engineering project that continues to shape nearly every decision made today. The shortage of land is obvious the moment you look at a map of Singapore, but the shortage of water is much harder to see.
For decades, water represented one of the country's greatest strategic vulnerabilities. Singapore simply didn't have enough natural freshwater sources to support a rapidly growing population and economy. Rainfall was plentiful, but collecting, storing, and distributing that water efficiently across such a small island presented enormous challenges. Even more concerning, much of Singapore's drinking water came through long-term agreements with neighboring Malaysia. Those agreements worked, but they also created a dependence that no government comfortable with long-term security wanted to accept forever. Water wasn't simply an environmental issue. It was a geopolitical issue, an economic issue, and ultimately a national security issue. If another country controls something you absolutely need every single day, your independence is never entirely complete. Instead of hoping that dependence would never become a problem, Singapore decided to remove as much of it as possible.
That decision launched one of the most ambitious water management programs anywhere in the world. Today, rainwater is collected through an enormous network of reservoirs and drainage systems that cover much of the island. Wastewater is cleaned through advanced treatment plants until it becomes so pure that much of it can safely return to the drinking supply. Desalination plants convert seawater into fresh water, despite the enormous energy costs involved. Every drop is carefully monitored, recycled whenever possible, and treated as a valuable national resource, rather than something that simply comes out of a tap. Visitors rarely think about where the water in their hotel room originated, but behind every glass sits decades of planning designed to eliminate one of Singapore's greatest vulnerabilities. What makes this approach remarkable isn't just the technology, it's the mindset behind it. Singapore rarely assumes that any critical resource will always remain available.
Instead, planners constantly ask, what happens if access suddenly disappears? That question influences far more than water. It shapes food security, energy policy, transportation planning, healthcare capacity, digital infrastructure, and even financial regulation. In many countries, governments prepare for likely problems. Singapore often prepares for unlikely ones as well. That philosophy explains why the island invests heavily in systems that may appear excessive until the day they're actually needed. Critics sometimes describe this as over-planning. Supporters argue it's precisely why Singapore avoids many crises that surprise other countries. Either way, the result is a society where resilience becomes part of everyday life, even when most people never notice it. The same thinking transformed transportation. Building roads forever was never a realistic option because there simply wasn't enough space.
If every family owned multiple cars, traffic would eventually overwhelm the entire city, regardless of how efficiently roads were designed. Many growing cities around the world eventually discover this problem after decades of expansion. Singapore recognized it much earlier and made a controversial choice. Instead of encouraging unlimited car ownership, the government deliberately made owning a private vehicle expensive. Purchasing a car often involves paying for a certificate that grants permission to own one, and those certificates can cost astonishing amounts depending on market demand. Additional taxes further increase the overall cost. To outsiders, these prices can seem almost unbelievable. But the objective isn't revenue alone, it's traffic management. By controlling the total number of vehicles entering the roads, Singapore prevents congestion from reaching levels seen in many other major cities. At the same time, enormous investment flows into public transportation.
The subway system continues expanding. Buses connect neighborhoods with remarkable efficiency, and digital technology helps coordinate schedules across multiple modes of transport. The goal isn't to punish drivers. It's to ensure that public transportation becomes the easiest choice rather than the only affordable one. As a result, millions of daily journeys occur with a level of reliability that many cities struggle to achieve, despite having far more land available. Yet efficient transportation depends on something even less visible than roads or train tracks. It depends on data. Singapore has spent years building what many experts describe as one of the world's most digitally connected urban environments. Sensors monitor traffic flow, water consumption, electricity demand, air quality, flood risks, and countless other variables in real time. Cameras assist with transportation management, public safety, and infrastructure maintenance.
Digital platforms allow government agencies to respond more quickly when problems appear. Information that might remain scattered across different departments in larger countries is increasingly connected into integrated systems designed to identify patterns before they become serious disruptions. This extensive use of technology often attracts admiration for its efficiency, but it also raises important questions about privacy and surveillance. Singapore has long maintained that extensive monitoring contributes to safety, crime prevention, and better public services. Critics argue that such systems can also increase governmental oversight of everyday life. Both perspectives exist simultaneously, reflecting one of the central trade-offs that defines modern Singapore. Many residents value the extraordinary levels of security, cleanliness, and reliability. Others continue debating how much personal privacy societies should exchange for greater order and efficiency.
That debate has become increasingly relevant as more countries explore similar technologies. Singapore simply arrived there earlier than most. Safety itself represents another area where careful planning extends beyond what visitors immediately notice. Crime rates remain among the lowest in the world, but that outcome reflects far more than policing alone. Urban design plays a surprisingly important role. Streets are well lit. Public housing neighborhoods remain active throughout the day. Parks, schools, shopping centers, and transportation hubs are intentionally integrated so that isolated areas become less common. Public spaces receive constant maintenance because neglected environments often encourage further neglect. Broken infrastructure is repaired quickly. Graffiti rarely remains visible for long. Small problems receive attention before they grow into larger ones. This philosophy resembles preventive medicine more than emergency response.
Rather than constantly reacting to crises, Singapore attempts to reduce the conditions that allow many problems to develop in the first place. The same preventive mindset appears in healthcare, where early screening programs, vaccination campaigns, and long-term planning help reduce future costs while improving overall public health. Preventing problems almost always proves cheaper than solving them later. Singapore has applied that principle across remarkably different sectors for decades. Of course, no system remains perfect forever. As Singapore became wealthier, entirely new challenges began replacing the old ones. An aging population means healthcare costs continue rising. Younger generations face increasingly expensive housing, despite extensive government involvement. Competition for highly skilled workers has intensified as other countries improve their own education systems and technological capabilities.
Climate change introduces additional uncertainty, particularly for a low-lying island surrounded by rising seas. Massive investments are now directed toward coastal defences, drainage improvements, and long-term environmental adaptation because planners assume today's successful infrastructure may not be sufficient several decades from now. Once again, the pattern repeats itself. Every achievement creates a fresh set of risks that require another layer of planning. Success never eliminates uncertainty, it simply changes its form. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Singapore isn't that it solved impossible problems, it's that the country never behaves as though those solutions are permanent. There is an underlying assumption running through nearly every major decision. If something works today, it may eventually stop working tomorrow. That belief encourages constant adjustment rather than complacency. Policies are revised, infrastructure is upgraded, economic priorities shift.
New technologies are tested before old ones become obsolete. In many places, governments wait until systems begin failing before making significant changes. Singapore often tries to change them while they still appear successful. That willingness to evolve may be the least visible feature of the entire country, yet it could also be the most important. Because beneath the image of flawless streets and futuristic buildings lies a nation that still sees itself not as a finished masterpiece, but as an unfinished project that can never afford to stop improving. If there is one place where Singapore's philosophy becomes impossible to ignore, it's the airport. Most airports are designed to move people from one flight to another as efficiently as possible. Singapore's main airport was designed to do something much more ambitious. It was built to convince the world that this tiny island deserved to become one of the most important transportation hubs on Earth.
Every year, tens of millions of passengers pass through without ever intending to stay in the country. Yet every traveller represents an opportunity. Some return later as tourists. Others arrive as investors, entrepreneurs, researchers, or employees. The airport isn't simply a transportation facility. It's one of the country's most powerful economic engines. Everything from immigration procedures to baggage handling, retail spaces, security, and terminal expansion reflects decades of planning centered around one simple idea. If Singapore cannot be the biggest market, it can become the place where the world's markets naturally connect. Geography gave Singapore an advantage, sitting along one of the busiest shipping routes on the planet. But geography alone never guarantees success. Plenty of countries occupy strategic locations without becoming global hubs.
Singapore invested relentlessly to make sure ships, airplanes, financial transactions and information could move through the island faster and more predictably than almost anywhere else. The port of Singapore became one of the busiest container ports in the world, handling enormous volumes of global trade every single day. Containers filled with electronics, machinery, clothing, chemicals, food, and countless other products often spend only a short time on the island before continuing toward another destination. Speed matters enormously because every extra hour costs shipping companies money. Singapore understood that efficiency itself could become a competitive advantage. Cranes became more automated. Logistics systems became increasingly digital. Customs procedures were streamlined. Warehouses were strategically located. Roads, ports, airports, and industrial parks were connected into a single coordinated network rather than operating independently.
Every improvement saved time, and over millions of shipments, those saved minutes translated into billions of dollars. Yet global trade is constantly changing. Manufacturing gradually shifted across Asia. Supply chains became more complex. E-commerce accelerated demand for faster delivery. Geopolitical tensions began affecting international commerce in ways few had anticipated decades earlier. Once again, Singapore refused to assume that yesterday's success would automatically continue tomorrow. Instead of relying exclusively on shipping, the country expanded into financial services, biomedical research, semiconductor manufacturing, digital technology, cybersecurity, and advanced engineering. Diversification became another form of national insurance. If one industry slowed, others could continue driving growth. That strategy explains why Singapore often appears to reinvent itself every decade. The city you see today isn't simply a larger version of the Singapore that existed 20 years ago. In many ways, it's performing entirely different economic functions. This constant evolution also explains why foreign talent became such an important part of Singapore's development. For a country with a relatively small population, finding enough highly skilled workers has always been a challenge. Universities produce thousands of graduates every year, but economic growth frequently creates demand faster than domestic education alone can supply it. As a result, Singapore has actively attracted professionals, scientists, engineers, executives, entrepreneurs, and researchers from around the world. Their expertise helps expand industries that might otherwise struggle to grow. At the same time, large numbers of foreign workers perform jobs in construction, shipyards, maintenance, and other physically demanding sectors that keep the city functioning every day. This international workforce contributes enormously to Singapore's success, but it also introduces social and political complexities. Housing demand increases, infrastructure faces additional pressure. Questions about wages, integration, identity, and long-term population growth become more sensitive. Maintaining economic competitiveness while preserving social stability requires constant balancing, and Singapore continues adjusting its policies as circumstances change. That balancing act extends into another area many outsiders find surprising. Despite its reputation for free markets and international business, Singapore's government remains deeply involved in shaping the economy. It doesn't usually operate by replacing private companies with state ownership. Instead, it often acts as a long-term strategist, identifying industries worth supporting, investing in research, encouraging innovation, and creating conditions that attract private investment.
Government-linked companies participate in sectors ranging from aviation and telecommunications to finance and real estate. Sovereign wealth funds invest globally, generating returns that strengthen national finances while reducing dependence on taxation alone. This combination of market competition and long-term state planning doesn't fit neatly into traditional economic categories. Some observers describe it as highly pragmatic rather than ideological. Policies are often judged less by whether they fit a particular political philosophy and more by whether they produce measurable results. That emphasis on performance has become one of Singapore's defining characteristics. Success is expected to be demonstrated through outcomes rather than promises. The same practical mindset appears in environmental planning, where Singapore has built an international reputation as one of the greenest major cities despite its extraordinary urban density.
At first glance, the skyline seems dominated by glass towers and concrete developments. Yet trees, gardens, rooftop vegetation, and carefully designed parks appear almost everywhere. This isn't simply about aesthetics. Green spaces help reduce temperatures in an intensely urban environment. They improve air quality, support biodiversity, absorb rainwater, and create more comfortable public spaces for millions of residents. Building vertically, rather than spreading endlessly across the landscape, allows more land to remain available for parks and nature reserves. Developers are often encouraged or required to replace greenery lost during construction with vegetation integrated into new buildings. Some skyscrapers contain gardens that climb dozens of floors into the air. Entire neighborhoods are designed around the idea that dense urban development and extensive greenery do not necessarily have to compete with each other. But maintaining that balance requires continuous investment.
Tropical vegetation grows quickly, demanding regular maintenance. Climate change brings hotter temperatures and more intense rainfall. Engineers and environmental planners work together because managing nature inside a dense city is no less complex than managing transportation or housing. Behind every peaceful park lies another carefully engineered system that most visitors never notice. Perhaps nothing illustrates Singapore's long-term thinking better than land itself. Although the country cannot naturally expand very far, it has literally increased its physical size by reclaiming land from the sea. Over decades, massive engineering projects have created new districts, industrial areas, airports, ports, and residential neighborhoods where open water once existed. Entire coastlines have been reshaped. This process is expensive, technically challenging, and environmentally controversial. Yet it reflects Singapore's refusal to accept geographical limitations as fixed realities. If more land is needed, engineers search for ways to create it. That attitude has allowed the country to continue growing, despite occupying one of the smallest sovereign territories in the world. Even so, reclaimed land introduces new engineering challenges related to stability, drainage, and rising sea levels. Every solution generates another set of technical questions, requiring even more innovation. This endless cycle may be the defining feature of Singapore itself. The country never reaches a point where planning ends, because every successful project changes the conditions that planners must address next. Looking across Singapore today, it's easy to focus on visible achievements: remarkable wealth, low crime, efficient transportation, world-class healthcare, modern architecture, thriving businesses, and exceptionally clean streets. Those accomplishments are real, but they are ultimately symptoms of something deeper.
The true foundation of Singapore isn't any individual building, policy, or technology. It's a national habit of constantly asking uncomfortable questions long before problems become emergencies. What happens if water supplies disappear? What happens if shipping routes change? What happens if sea levels rise? What happens if technology replaces existing industries? What happens if population growth slows? What happens if another global crisis disrupts international trade? Instead of assuming stability will continue forever, Singapore repeatedly plans for instability while conditions are still favorable. That mindset may be the closest thing the country has to a secret. It isn't perfection that makes Singapore extraordinary. It's the realization that perfection can never be permanent, and that the only way to preserve success is to prepare continuously for the day when success alone is no longer enough. For all of its remarkable achievements, Singapore has never escaped criticism.
In fact, some people argue that the same system responsible for creating one of the world's safest and most efficient cities also demands sacrifices that many other societies would find difficult to accept. This is where the story becomes far more complicated than the polished images seen in travel advertisements. Visitors usually experience Singapore for a few days. They admire the clean streets, the modern skyline, the organized transportation, and the sense of security that seems almost unbelievable in a city of millions. Living there, however, means becoming part of a system where rules are rarely treated as suggestions. The government has long believed that predictable behavior creates predictable outcomes. If everyone understands the rules, and those rules are consistently enforced, society becomes easier to manage.
Whether it's littering, vandalism, tax collection, public transportation, construction standards, food safety, or business regulation, enforcement tends to be strict and remarkably consistent. Supporters point to the results. Crime remains low, public spaces stay clean, government services function efficiently, corruption remains among the lowest anywhere in the world. Critics respond that such order inevitably raises questions about personal freedom, public expression, and the role of government in everyday life. Singapore has spent decades navigating this balance, and the conversation continues today. Interestingly, many residents view this trade-off differently than outsiders often expect. Surveys have repeatedly shown that safety, stability, reliable public services, and economic opportunity
rank extremely high among public priorities. For many Singaporeans, daily life works in ways that residents of larger cities sometimes take for granted as impossible. Children regularly use public transportation alone. Walking through downtown districts late at night generally feels safe. Public parks remain well maintained. Infrastructure failures are relatively rare. Administrative services that might require weeks elsewhere can often be completed digitally within hours. These everyday conveniences gradually become part of normal life, making it easy to forget how unusual they actually are on a global scale. The remarkable efficiency visitors notice isn't limited to spectacular projects or iconic landmarks. It extends into countless ordinary interactions that quietly shape daily routines. Even something as simple as renewing government documents, paying taxes, scheduling medical appointments, or registering a business has increasingly moved onto integrated digital platforms. The government has invested heavily in making public administration faster, simpler, and more connected.
Instead of forcing citizens to repeatedly submit the same information across multiple agencies, systems increasingly communicate with one another. Digital identity services allow people to access healthcare records, education information, financial services, and government portals through secure online platforms. These investments may not generate dramatic headlines, but together they reduce enormous amounts of wasted time. Time itself becomes another national resource that Singapore attempts to protect. Saving millions of people just a few hours each year eventually translates into significant economic benefits. This obsession with efficiency even influences architecture. Walk through the city and many buildings seem designed not simply to look impressive, but to perform multiple functions simultaneously.
Residential towers often include shopping areas on lower floors, community centers nearby, schools within walking distance, green spaces integrated into surrounding neighborhoods, and public transportation stations located only minutes away. Instead of separating different aspects of daily life across long distances, urban planners frequently try to combine them. This reduces commuting time, lowers transportation demand, and encourages neighborhoods where residents can accomplish most daily activities without traveling across the entire city. Mixed-use development has become common in many cities today, but Singapore embraced this approach decades before it became an international planning trend. Limited land forced the country to maximize every square meter, and that necessity gradually produced some of the world's most sophisticated urban design strategies.
The same philosophy applies underground, where enormous networks of tunnels carry electricity, telecommunications, water systems, transportation infrastructure, and other essential services beneath the surface. Planning vertically means thinking not only upward with skyscrapers, but downward as well. Every layer of the city performs multiple functions, many of which remain completely invisible to people walking above. Yet perhaps the most important investment Singapore has ever made cannot be photographed from the street. It exists inside classrooms, laboratories, research centers, and universities. As manufacturing became more advanced and technology increasingly shaped the global economy, Singapore recognized that competing on low labor costs would eventually become impossible. Countries with much larger populations could always produce goods more cheaply. The only sustainable strategy was to compete through knowledge, innovation, and highly specialized industries.
Government funding increasingly supported scientific research, engineering, biomedical technology, artificial intelligence, clean energy, cybersecurity, and advanced manufacturing. Universities expanded partnerships with leading international institutions. Research parks attracted global companies seeking access to skilled talent and stable infrastructure. Rather than viewing education as something that ends with graduation, Singapore increasingly emphasized lifelong learning. Workers are encouraged to update their skills throughout their careers because industries evolve much faster than they did a generation ago. The government actively supports retraining programs, recognizing that jobs disappearing because of automation may eventually be replaced by entirely different professions requiring completely new expertise.
preparing people for change has become almost as important as preparing infrastructure. This forward-looking approach became especially valuable during global crises.
The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how quickly modern economies can be disrupted by unexpected events. Like every country, Singapore faced enormous challenges. Borders closed, international travel collapsed, supply chains were interrupted, and businesses struggled under unprecedented restrictions. Yet many existing systems designed for resilience proved valuable during the crisis. Digital government services allowed essential administrative functions to continue. Strong healthcare infrastructure supported widespread testing and vaccination efforts. Financial reserves accumulated during years of economic growth helped stabilize businesses and workers affected by temporary shutdowns. The pandemic also exposed vulnerabilities that planners had not fully anticipated, particularly regarding dependence on migrant workers living in densely populated dormitories. Those outbreaks became one of the country's most significant public health challenges during the early stages of the pandemic.
Once again, Singapore responded by revising policies, improving living conditions, strengthening health protections, and adapting existing systems, rather than assuming previous success guaranteed future resilience. That pattern has repeated throughout the country's history. Problems are rarely viewed as isolated failures. They become opportunities to redesign the system itself. This willingness to constantly revise existing policies may be one of Singapore's greatest strengths. Many governments hesitate to acknowledge weaknesses because doing so can appear politically costly. Singapore often approaches problems more like engineers than politicians. If something doesn't produce the desired outcome, adjustments are made, performance is measured again, and further improvements follow if necessary. The process rarely ends because no system remains perfectly suited to changing circumstances forever.
This culture of continuous optimization extends beyond government into many businesses, schools, research institutions, and public organizations. Incremental improvement becomes part of everyday thinking rather than an occasional reform effort. Over decades, thousands of small improvements accumulate into dramatic long-term transformation. Looking at Singapore today, it's tempting to imagine that the country discovered a perfect formula for urban success. In reality, the opposite may be closer to the truth. Singapore behaves as though no formula remains perfect for very long. Every solution eventually creates new limitations. Every competitive advantage gradually attracts competitors. Every generation inherits challenges different from those faced by the previous one. Instead of searching for permanent answers, Singapore has built a culture that expects constant adaptation. That may explain why the city often feels strangely futuristic, even when compared with other wealthy nations.
The future isn't something Singapore waits for. It's something the country spends enormous amounts of time trying to anticipate before it arrives. And perhaps that's the most remarkable lesson hidden beneath the famous skyline. Singapore didn't become one of the world's most admired cities because it eliminated uncertainty. It became extraordinary because it learned how to organize itself around uncertainty, treating every success as the beginning of the next problem that still needs to be solved. Standing on the observation deck of one of Singapore's tallest buildings, it's easy to believe you've found a blueprint for the perfect city. The skyline stretches across reclaimed land that didn't even exist a few decades ago. Cargo ships line the horizon, waiting their turn to enter one of the busiest ports on Earth. Passenger aircraft appear every few minutes, connecting the island to hundreds of destinations across the globe. Trains move beneath the streets with remarkable precision.
Parks weave between office towers. Reservoirs quietly store rainwater collected from across the city. Millions of people go about their daily routines inside a system that seems almost unbelievably organized. But perhaps the biggest misconception about Singapore is the idea that it has reached its final form. The country itself would probably reject that description. Behind nearly every long-term national strategy lies the assumption that today's solutions may not survive tomorrow's challenges. That belief is becoming more important than ever because the problems Singapore faces over the coming decades are fundamentally different from the ones it solved in the past. Economic competition no longer comes primarily from neighboring countries. Today, Singapore competes with global financial centers, technology hubs, research clusters, and innovation ecosystems spread across every continent. Cities that once looked towards Singapore for inspiration are now developing their own advanced infrastructure, digital government platforms, biotechnology industries, and world-class universities. The gap that once separated Singapore from much of the developing world has narrowed considerably. Remaining ahead requires constant reinvention rather than simply maintaining existing advantages. Artificial intelligence represents one of the clearest examples of this shift. As AI transforms finance, logistics, healthcare, manufacturing, education, and government administration, Singapore faces both enormous opportunities and serious risks. The same technologies capable of making the economy more productive could also replace large numbers of existing jobs. Preparing for that transition means investing not only in technology itself, but also in helping workers continuously develop new skills throughout their careers. The country has increasingly emphasized that education can no longer be viewed as something completed in early adulthood. Instead, learning becomes an ongoing process extending across an entire working life. This philosophy reflects a broader reality that Singapore has understood for decades. Human capital remains its single most valuable natural resource because almost every other resource is limited. The demographic challenge may prove even more complicated. Like many developed economies, Singapore has one of the world's lowest birth rates. People are living longer, while fewer children are being born each year. Over time, this gradually changes the balance between working-age adults and retirees. Healthcare costs increase, pension systems face additional pressure, employers compete more aggressively for skilled workers, economic growth becomes harder to sustain without either significant productivity improvements or continued immigration. Yet immigration itself remains a sensitive issue because rapid population growth places additional pressure on housing, transportation, education, and healthcare infrastructure. Balancing economic needs with social cohesion requires increasingly careful policymaking. Every decision influences multiple parts of the system simultaneously. A policy encouraging faster economic expansion may increase housing demand. More housing requires additional land or higher density. Higher density increases transportation requirements. More transportation demands additional energy and infrastructure. In Singapore, almost every challenge connects directly to several others. Nothing exists in isolation. Climate change introduces another layer of complexity unlike anything previous generations confronted. Singapore sits only a few meters above sea level in many areas, making coastal protection an enormous long-term priority. Rising oceans, stronger storms, and more intense rainfall threaten infrastructure built over decades. Engineers are already developing massive coastal defense projects designed to protect the island throughout the coming century. Drainage systems continue expanding to manage increasingly unpredictable weather patterns. Buildings are designed with greater environmental resilience in mind. Green technologies receive growing investment not only because they reduce emissions, but because they strengthen long-term national security. Energy efficiency, renewable power, and sustainable urban design increasingly serve economic as well as environmental goals. Once again, Singapore approaches an emerging global problem through the same familiar lens. Rather than asking whether change will happen, planners assume it will and begin preparing years in advance. This mindset also influences foreign policy. Singapore has always depended on international trade, stable shipping routes, and open global markets. Unlike larger countries with extensive domestic resources, it cannot easily isolate itself from global events. Economic recessions, geopolitical tensions, trade disputes, supply chain disruptions, and regional instability all have the potential to affect the country's future. As a result, Singapore consistently emphasizes international cooperation while maintaining strong relationships with a wide range of global partners. Stability beyond its borders often matters almost as much as stability within them. This outward-looking perspective explains why the country invests heavily in diplomacy, international commerce, financial credibility, and legal certainty. Trust remains one of its most valuable assets because international businesses, investors, and governments all prefer predictable environments when making long-term decisions. Losing that reputation would carry enormous consequences. Maintaining it requires constant discipline. Looking back over the past 60 years, the transformation remains astonishing. A small island with almost no natural resources evolved into one of the world's leading financial centers, one of its busiest transportation hubs, one of its safest major cities, and one of its most technologically advanced urban environments. Yet none of those achievements resulted from a single breakthrough or one extraordinary decision. They emerged from thousands of interconnected policies implemented consistently across generations. Housing supported stability. Stability attracted investment. Investment funded education. Education strengthened the workforce. A stronger workforce attracted more advanced industries. Economic growth financed better infrastructure. Better infrastructure improved competitiveness. Each success reinforced the next, creating a cycle that gradually accelerated over time.
Perhaps that's why Singapore often appears so different from cities that attempted to copy individual parts of its model. Building modern skyscrapers alone doesn't recreate Singapore. Installing surveillance cameras doesn't recreate Singapore. Expanding public transportation doesn't recreate Singapore. The strength of the system comes from the way each component supports every other component simultaneously. Remove enough pieces, and the entire structure begins functioning differently. That interconnected design may be Singapore's greatest accomplishment. It isn't merely a collection of successful policies. It's a network of systems intentionally built to reinforce one another over decades. Whether that model can continue adapting to an increasingly unpredictable world remains one of the most important questions facing the country today. But if history offers any indication, Singapore is unlikely to wait until those challenges become unavoidable.
The nation's greatest advantage has never been its skyline, its wealth, its airport, or even its extraordinary efficiency. Its greatest advantage has been a culture of planning that refuses to believe success is permanent. While many places celebrate reaching the top, Singapore continues behaving as though the climb has only just begun. That mindset may ultimately explain why so many people describe it as the world's most perfect city. Not because it has solved every problem, but because it never stops preparing for the next one.